My MIL walked into court smiling with evidence, but one question silenced them. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind me with the finality of a coffin lid. My hands trembled as I clutched my purse, the custody papers inside feeling heavier than my 8-month-old daughter Emma ever had in my arms. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was fighting to keep the child I'd carried for 9 months, delivered after 14 hours of labor, and nursed every 2 hours since birth. Sarah, breathe. My lawyer, David Chen, touched my elbow gently. Remember what we discussed. Margaret can bring whatever she wants, but evidence has rules. I nodded, though my throat felt like sandpaper. Through the glass doors of courtroom 3B, I could see her, Margaret Walsh, my mother-in-law, sitting ramrod straight in her pressed navy suit. Even from here, her silver hair was immaculate, not a strand out of place. She looked like a perfect grandmother, the kind who baked cookies and knitted baby blankets. She'd never baked Emma a single cookie. Mrs. Walsh? The bailiff's voice cut through my thoughts. Judge Morrison is ready for you. As we entered the courtroom, Margaret turned slightly, and I caught the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. My stomach dropped. She looked like a cat who'd cornered a mouse, and I was definitely the mouse. All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison. The next few minutes blurred together, the judge's opening remarks, David's steady voice outlining our position, the clinical discussion of my fitness as a parent like I was a broken appliance being evaluated for repair. Then Margaret's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Holmes, stood up. Your Honor, we have compelling evidence that demonstrates Mrs. Walsh's concerns about her daughter-in-law's ability to provide a safe, stable environment for the child. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, whatever Margaret had been planning for months, orchestrating with the patience of a spider spinning a web. We'd like to present photographic evidence taken over the past 6 weeks, documenting incidents of negligence and concerning behavior. Patricia Holmes produced a manila envelope thick with photographs. Margaret's smile widened just a fraction, and she leaned forward slightly in her chair. After Michael, her son, my ex-husband, had walked out 3 months ago, claiming I was too stressed and not the woman he married, Margaret had swooped in like a vulture. Suddenly she was everywhere, showing up unannounced, offering to help with Emma, making comments about how tired I looked, how the house wasn't as clean as it used to be. Judge Morrison accepted the envelope, his weathered face impassive as he began examining the contents. I caught glimpses, photos of me in my bathrobe at 2 p.m., after being up all night with a colicky baby, Emma's toys scattered across the living room floor, me carrying Emma while talking animatedly on the phone. These photographs, Patricia continued, show a pattern of neglect. In Exhibit A, we see the defendant in her nightclothes in the middle of the afternoon, suggesting poor personal hygiene and depression. Exhibit B shows the dangerous living conditions, choking hazards scattered throughout the home. And Exhibit C captures the defendant engaged in what appears to be an agitated phone conversation while holding the infant. Each word felt like a physical blow. Margaret had taken innocent moments, the exhaustion every new mother feels, the reality of living with a baby, a heated conversation with my insurance company about Emma's medical bills, and twisted them into evidence of my inadequacy. But David wasn't looking at the photographs. He was staring directly at Margaret, and something in his expression made me sit up straighter. Your Honor, he said quietly, I have just one question about these photographs. The courtroom went silent. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her keys. David's voice had carried a weight that made everyone lean forward, including Judge Morrison. Proceed, Mr. Chen, the judge said, setting down the photographs. David stood slowly, and I noticed Margaret's smile falter for the first time since we'd entered the courtroom. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed once against her purse, a tiny crack in her composed facade. Mrs. Walsh, David addressed Margaret directly, these photographs are quite detailed. The timestamps show they were taken on various dates, September 15th at 2:17 p.m., September 22nd at 4:43 p.m., October 3rd at 11:28 a.m., and so forth. Very precise documentation. Margaret nodded, her chin lifting slightly. I've been concerned about my granddaughter's welfare for weeks. When I noticed these troubling patterns, I felt compelled to document them. Of course, David said, his tone almost conversational. And where exactly were you standing when you took these photographs? The question hung in the air like smoke. I watched Margaret's face, saw the microscopic tightening around her eyes. Patricia Holmes shifted in her chair, and I caught her shooting a quick glance at her client. I was visiting, naturally, Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Visiting, David repeated. So Sarah invited you over on September 15th at 2:17 in the afternoon? My breath caught. September 15th, I remembered that day clearly because it was Emma's 6-month checkup. I'd been home alone, exhausted from the appointment and the shots that had made Emma fussy. Margaret hadn't been inside my house that day. I was certain of it. Not exactly invited, Margaret admitted. But the front door was unlocked, and I was concerned. David picked up one of the photographs from the judge's desk. This image shows my client in her living room, taken from what appears to be the kitchen doorway. You entered her home without permission to take this photograph? Margaret's lawyer was on her feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Walsh was acting out of legitimate concern for her grandchild's welfare. Overruled. The witness will answer. But David wasn't finished. He lifted another photograph. This one is particularly interesting. October 3rd, 11:28 a.m. The angle suggests it was taken from outside the living room window. Mrs. Walsh, were you standing in my client's backyard when you took this picture? The color had drained from Margaret's face. I suddenly understood why she looked so satisfied. She thought she'd been clever, documenting my supposed failures. But she'd also documented her own illegal behavior. I was checking on them, Margaret stammered. Sarah hasn't been returning my calls, and I was worried about Emma's safety. So worried that you repeatedly entered her property without permission, let yourself into her home, and took photographs through her windows over a period of 6 weeks, David said. Your Honor, I believe what we have here isn't evidence of my client's unfitness as a parent, but rather documentation of systematic stalking and invasion of privacy. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted dramatically. He was no longer looking at the photographs as evidence against me, but as something else entirely. Mrs. Walsh, did you at any point obtain permission to enter your daughter-in-law's home or property to take these photographs? Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The competent woman who'd walked in here with evidence to destroy me was crumbling before my eyes. She's my granddaughter, Margaret whispered, as if that explained everything. But it explained nothing, and we all knew it. The silence stretched like a taut wire. I watched Margaret's face cycle through emotions, shock, desperation, and finally, something that looked like rage. Her mask was slipping, and the woman beneath wasn't the composed grandmother she pretended to be. Your Honor, Patricia Holmes said, scrambling to salvage her case, Mrs. Walsh's methods may have been unconventional, but the evidence still speaks to concerning conditions. The evidence speaks to criminal trespass, Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp. Mr. Chen, do you have any additional questions? David wasn't done. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he carefully placed the photograph back on the judge's desk. Just a few more, Your Honor. Mrs. Walsh, you mentioned that Sarah hasn't been returning your calls. How many times did you attempt to contact her before resorting to surveillance? Margaret's hands were shaking now. Several times. She was being unreasonable. Define several. I don't keep exact count. Your Honor, David said, pulling out his phone, I'd like to submit phone records showing that Mrs. Walsh called my client 47 times between August 15th and September 30th. That's more than once per day. Additionally, she sent 62 text messages and left 18 voicemails during the same period. My stomach lurched. I'd known Margaret had been calling constantly, but hearing the actual numbers made it sound even worse. Obsessive. Unhinged. Furthermore, David continued, these records show that Mrs. Walsh called my client's workplace, Mercy General Hospital, 11 times in 2 weeks, claiming various emergencies involving Emma that required Sarah to leave her nursing shifts. That was news to me. I'd been written up twice for leaving work suddenly when Margaret called crying about Emma having a high fever or not eating. Each time, when I'd rushed home, Emma had been perfectly fine, and Margaret would claim she'd been overreacting because she loved her granddaughter so much. Judge Morrison was making notes. Mrs. Walsh, did you make false emergency calls to your daughter-in-law's workplace? They weren't false, Margaret protested, but her voice cracked. Babies can take turns for the worse so quickly. I was being cautious. 11 times in 2 weeks, the judge repeated. All false alarms. Patricia Holmes looked like she wanted to crawl under her table. Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess. No need, Judge Morrison said. Mr. Chen, continue. David lifted another photograph, this one showing me on my back porch at night, visible through the kitchen window. I was holding Emma, swaying gently, something I did when she couldn't sleep. But in the photo, taken with a flash in the darkness, I looked haggard and desperate. This photograph is timestamped October 12th at 11:47 p.m., David said. Mrs. Walsh, you were in my client's backyard at nearly midnight, taking pictures through her window of her caring for her baby? The courtroom felt suffocating. I remembered that night, Emma had been teething and inconsolable. I'd walked her around the house for hours, finally ending up in the kitchen because the tile was cool under my bare feet. The idea that Margaret had been out there in the darkness, watching, photographing, made my skin crawl. I was concerned, Margaret started. You were trespassing, Judge Morrison cut her off. At midnight. With a camera. He looked at Patricia Holmes. Counselor, are you aware that your client may have committed multiple felonies in gathering this so-called evidence? Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. That woman is unfit to raise my granddaughter. Michael left her because she's unstable, and now she's trying to keep Emma away from family who actually cares about her. Sit down, the judge ordered. But Margaret wasn't sitting down. She was unraveling, and we were all witnessing it in real time. I have given that woman every opportunity to be a good mother. Margaret's voice rose to a shrill pitch that made Emma, who was with my sister in the hallway, start crying through the closed courtroom doors. I've tried to help her, tried to guide her, but she's selfish and incompetent. Mrs. Walsh, sit down immediately, Judge Morrison commanded, his gavel hitting the bench with a sharp crack. But Margaret was beyond listening. The careful facade she'd maintained for months was cracking like ice in spring. She leaves Emma crying for hours. I've heard it through the walls. Through the walls? David interrupted, and I saw his eyes sharpen. Mrs. Walsh, could you clarify that statement? Patricia Holmes was frantically whispering stop talking to her client, but Margaret had passed the point of no return. The baby cries constantly because Sarah doesn't know what she's doing. I live next door, I hear everything. Next door? Judge Morrison leaned forward. I was under the impression you lived in Millbrook, Mrs. Walsh. That's 12 miles from your daughter-in-law's residence. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain completely from Margaret's face as she realized what she just admitted. Even I didn't know what she meant about living next door. My neighbors were the elderly Hendersons on one side and a young couple, the Garcias, on the other. I meant. Margaret's hands fluttered helplessly. David was already pulling papers from his briefcase. Your Honor, I have here property records that I obtained this morning after some concerning information came to my attention. It appears that on August 1st, 2 weeks after my client filed for divorce from Michael Walsh, Mrs. Walsh purchased the rental property at 847 Maple Street under an LLC. My blood turned to ice. 847 Maple Street was the Garcia house. Maria Garcia had mentioned her landlord was selling, that they'd have to move out by August, but I'd been too overwhelmed with the divorce and Emma's care to pay attention to neighborhood gossip. That's the house directly adjacent to my client's residence, David continued. Mrs. Walsh, you purchased the house next door to Sarah specifically to conduct surveillance, didn't you? I bought it as an investment, Margaret whispered, but even Patricia Holmes was staring at her in horror now. Judge Morrison's face had gone from stern to thunderous. You purchased a house next door to the woman you're claiming is an unfit mother? When did you take possession? August 15th, Margaret admitted, the date barely audible. The same date the phone records showed her harassment campaign had intensified. The same time frame when the photographs began. I felt sick, remembering all the times over the past 2 months when I'd had the unsettling feeling of being watched, of being judged. Margaret hadn't just been dropping by unannounced, she'd been living next door, documenting my every move like some deranged private investigator. So these photographs, David said, spreading several across the table, weren't taken during innocent visits or chance encounters. They were taken by someone who purchased property specifically to spy on my client and her infant daughter. Your Honor, Patricia Holmes stood shakily. My client may have used poor judgment, but her intentions were. Her intentions, Judge Morrison cut her off, appear to be systematic stalking, harassment, and invasion of privacy. Mrs. Walsh, in the span of 10 minutes, you've admitted to entering your daughter-in-law's home without permission, conducting surveillance from her backyard at midnight, purchasing property specifically to monitor her activities, making false emergency calls to her workplace, and contacting her 47 times in 6 weeks despite being asked to stop. Margaret sank into her chair as if all the air had left her body. The competent woman who'd walked in here with her manila envelope of evidence looked suddenly frail and desperate. But I knew better. I'd seen this act before, Margaret playing the victim when her manipulations backfired. The rage was still there, simmering beneath her crumbling facade. There's more, David said quietly, and my heart stopped. What else could there possibly be? David reached into his briefcase and pulled out what looked like a small electronic device. My stomach clenched as I recognized it, a baby monitor receiver, the expensive kind with video capability that I'd registered for but never received at my baby's shower. Mrs. Walsh, do you recognize this device? David asked, holding it up for everyone to see. Margaret's eyes went wide, and she shook her head frantically. I've never seen that before in my life. Really? Because I found this in the basement of 847 Maple Street yesterday evening, after obtaining a warrant. David's voice was steady, clinical. It was positioned to receive transmissions from a camera that had been placed in my client's nursery. The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been watching Emma sleep. Watching me feed her, change her, rock her to sleep during those long, exhausting nights. My skin crawled as I thought about all the intimate moments of early motherhood that I believed were private. That's impossible, I whispered, but even as I said it, puzzle pieces were clicking into place. The baby monitor I thought was defective because it never seemed to work properly. The way Emma always seemed more agitated after Margaret's visits. The unnaturally detailed knowledge Margaret had about Emma's sleep schedule and eating habits. Judge Morrison's face had gone ashen. Mr. Chen, are you telling this court that Mrs. Walsh placed surveillance equipment in an infant's nursery? The device is currently being processed by the police for fingerprints, Your Honor, but the serial number matches a monitor purchased at Baby Paradise on July 28. David consulted his notes. The same day Mrs. Walsh's credit card was used to make a $347 purchase at that store. Margaret shot to her feet again. You can't prove I put that there. Maybe Sarah installed it herself to make me look bad. The desperation in her voice was palpable now. Patricia Holmes buried her face in her hands, clearly recognizing that her case had gone from weak to catastrophic. Actually, David continued, we can prove it. The camera component was found yesterday morning, hidden inside a stuffed lamb that Sarah believed was a gift from you. Is that correct, Mrs. Walsh? Did you give Emma a stuffed lamb on August 20th? I remembered that day clearly. Margaret had shown up unannounced, as usual, carrying a large white shopping bag. She'd made a big show of presenting Emma with an adorable stuffed lamb, cooing about how every baby needed a special friend to watch over them while they slept. I'd been touched by what seemed like a genuinely thoughtful gesture. I bought her a toy, yes, but... A toy with a hidden camera that transmitted directly to the receiver in your basement, David finished. Mrs. Walsh, you've been conducting illegal surveillance of an infant for 2 months. The courtroom erupted. Patricia Holmes was frantically shuffling papers, probably looking for a way to withdraw from the case entirely. The court reporter's fingers flew over her keys. Judge Morrison was making rapid notes, his pen scratching angrily across the paper. But Margaret wasn't done fighting. I could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hands clenched into fists. This was the real Margaret, not the grieving grandmother or the concerned mother-in-law, but the woman who'd spent months orchestrating an elaborate campaign to steal my child. Everything I did was for Emma, she screamed, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. That girl doesn't deserve to be a mother. She trapped my son with that pregnancy, and now she's using my granddaughter as a weapon against our family. Mrs. Walsh, Judge Morrison warned. No. I won't be silent while that woman destroys everything. Margaret whirled to face me directly, her perfectly composed mask finally, completely shattered. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? I will never stop fighting for Emma. Never. The bailiff was already moving toward Margaret as Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard. But her words hung in the air like a threat, and I knew this was far from over. The bailiff reached Margaret just as she lunged toward my table, her manicured nails extended like claws. You poisoned my son against his own family, she shrieked as Officer Reynolds caught her arm. Michael would still be home if you hadn't manipulated him with your fake depression and constant crying. Ma'am, you need to calm down, Officer Reynolds said firmly, but Margaret writhed in his grip like a wild animal. Fake depression? I found my voice for the first time since this nightmare began. Margaret, I had postpartum depression. My doctor. Lies, she spat, her silver hair now disheveled and falling across her face. You convinced that quack Dr. Martinez to give you pills so you could play victim. I saw the prescription bottles in your medicine cabinet. David shot me a sharp look. Medicine cabinet? When had she been in my bathroom? But before I could process that violation, Judge Morrison was on his feet. Remove Mrs. Walsh from my courtroom immediately, he ordered. She's in contempt. As Officer Reynolds began guiding Margaret toward the door, she twisted back to face Patricia Holmes. Tell them about the recording. Tell them what Michael said about her. Patricia Holmes looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, but she cleared her throat weakly. Your Honor, we do have one additional piece of evidence. A voicemail from Michael Walsh to his mother, dated October 15th. My blood ran cold. October 15th was 3 days ago, the night Emma had been up until 4 a.m. with an ear infection. I'd been exhausted, overwhelmed, and yes, I'd called Michael begging him to come help with his daughter. The call hadn't gone well. David's jaw tightened. Your Honor, any recording obtained without proper consent. It's a voicemail left on my client's personal phone, Patricia interrupted, pulling out a small digital recorder with trembling hands. Perfectly legal. Judge Morrison nodded grimly. Play it. The courtroom filled with static, then Michael's familiar voice, slurred with alcohol. Mom, you're right about Sarah. She called me tonight, completely hysterical. Said she couldn't handle Emma anymore, that she was at her breaking point. She actually said, his voice cracked, she said maybe Emma would be better off without her. My heart stopped. Those weren't my exact words, and Michael knew it. I'd said maybe Emma would be better off staying with him for a few days while I recovered from the flu I'd been fighting. But in his drunken retelling to his mother, filtered through months of her manipulation, it sounded like something entirely different. She's falling apart, Mom, Michael's voice continued through the speaker. Maybe you were right. Maybe Emma should be with family who can actually take care of her. The recording clicked off, leaving silence that felt heavier than lead. I watched Judge Morrison's expression shift, saw doubt creep back into his eyes. Margaret had stopped struggling against Officer Reynolds and was watching my face with renewed satisfaction. Your Honor, David said quickly, that recording is taken completely out of context. Is it? Judge Morrison interrupted, looking directly at me. Mrs. Walsh, Sarah, did you tell your ex-husband that your daughter might be better off without you? The question hung in the air like a noose. I could feel everyone staring at me, the judge, the lawyers, Margaret with her triumphant smirk. Through the glass doors, I could hear Emma crying in the hallway, and the sound made my chest ache with longing. I was sick, I whispered. I had been up for 3 nights straight. Emma had an ear infection, and I had the flu. I asked Michael if she could stay with him for a few days while I recovered. That's what I meant by. But you did say those words? Judge Morrison pressed. You did tell him she might be better off without you? I closed my eyes, remembering that horrible night. Emma screaming in pain, my fever making everything fuzzy and surreal, Michael's voicemail saying he was too busy to help with his own daughter. Yes, I admitted, the word barely audible. But I didn't mean. Margaret's lawyer was already standing. Your Honor, combined with the photographic evidence of neglect and this admission of inadequacy, we believe. The photographic evidence obtained through criminal stalking? David cut her off sharply. Your Honor, my client was ill and sleep-deprived when she made that comment. Every parent has moments of doubt, especially single mothers dealing with infant illness alone. But I could see the damage was done. Margaret had played her final card perfectly, and it was a good one. The recording made me sound unstable, desperate, willing to abandon my child. Combined with her twisted photographs, it painted a picture of a mother on the edge. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing when she stopped fighting the bailiff. She stood quietly now, her hair smoothed back into place, watching Judge Morrison wrestle with reasonable doubt. The silence stretched until I thought I might scream. Judge Morrison was studying the recording device like it held the secrets of the universe, while Margaret stood perfectly still beside Officer Reynolds, no longer fighting. She'd gotten what she wanted, that seed of doubt planted in the judge's mind. Your Honor, David said, his voice cutting through the tension, I'd like to call a witness who can provide context to that phone call. Patricia Holmes shot up. Objection. No witnesses were disclosed. Emergency witness, Your Honor. Dr. Elena Martinez from Mercy General's Pediatric Unit. She treated Emma Walsh on October 15th for acute otitis media. My heart leaped. Dr. Martinez, I'd forgotten she'd documented everything from that night. The emergency room visit, Emma's fever, my own obvious illness. Judge Morrison checked his watch. Is Dr. Martinez available? She's waiting in the hall, Your Honor. She came as soon as I called this morning. This is highly irregular, Patricia protested, but Judge Morrison was already nodding to the bailiff. 2 minutes later, Dr. Martinez entered the courtroom in her scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in the messy bun I remembered from that awful night. She looked tired, probably coming off a 12-hour shift, but alert. Dr. Martinez, David began after she was sworn in, did you treat Emma Walsh on October 15th at approximately 2:30 a.m.? Yes. 8-month-old female, high fever, extreme irritability. Classic presentation of acute ear infection. And the child's mother, Sarah Walsh? Dr. Martinez looked directly at me with kind eyes. Also presented with symptoms of influenza. Temperature of 101.2, obvious dehydration, exhaustion. I actually considered admitting her as well. In your professional opinion, was Sarah Walsh's distressed state during that visit consistent with a caring mother dealing with a sick child while ill herself? Absolutely. She was clearly unwell but refused pain medication because she was breastfeeding. She hadn't slept in over 60 hours and was still prioritizing her daughter's needs over her own comfort. Margaret's satisfied expression began to crack around the edges. Did Mrs. Walsh express any concerning thoughts about her ability to parent? David continued. She asked if Emma might recover faster staying with her father for a few days while she got over the flu. She was worried about transmitting the virus to an already sick infant. Dr. Martinez paused. It was actually very responsible thinking. And did you document your interaction with Mrs. Walsh that night? Of course. Dr. Martinez pulled out a tablet. Patient showed appropriate maternal concern, asked relevant questions about infant care during illness, demonstrated proper feeding and comforting techniques. No signs of postpartum psychosis or thoughts of harm. Recommended family support during recovery period. The recording that had sounded so damning 5 minutes ago now seemed like exactly what it was, a sick, exhausted mother asking for help. But Margaret wasn't finished. I watched her whisper something to Patricia Holmes, who reluctantly stood. Dr. Martinez, are you aware that Mrs. Walsh has been prescribed antidepressants? Yes, a low-dose SSRI for postpartum depression, which affects 15% of new mothers. She's been compliant with treatment and regular follow-ups. And is it true that she's called the pediatric helpline 17 times in 8 months? My cheeks burned. Yes, I've called frequently, especially in those first terrifying weeks when every sound Emma made seemed potentially catastrophic. Yes, Dr. Martinez replied calmly, which is completely normal for a first-time mother. We encourage parents to call with questions. It shows engagement and concern for the child's well-being. 17 times seems excessive. Mrs. Holmes, Dr. Martinez interrupted with steel in her voice. I've been practicing pediatric medicine for 12 years. The parents who call frequently asking questions are not the ones we worry about. It's the ones who never call that concern us. Judge Morrison was making more notes, his expression unreadable. Margaret's face had gone pale again, her moment of triumph slipping away like sand through her fingers. Dr. Martinez, David said, one final question. In your professional opinion, is Sarah Walsh a fit mother? Completely. She's attentive, loving, and advocates appropriately for her child's needs. Emma is thriving under her care. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something that looked almost like panic. She leaned forward in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. That's not true, Margaret said, her voice carrying across the quiet courtroom despite Officer Reynolds still standing beside her. Emma cries constantly when she's with Sarah. I've heard it through the walls for weeks. Dr. Martinez turned to look at Margaret directly. Ma'am, infant crying is normal developmental behavior. 8-month-olds cry an average of 2 to 3 hours per day, often clustered in evening hours. What you're describing sounds completely typical. Not like this, Margaret insisted, her composure cracking again. It goes on for hours. Sometimes I can hear Sarah crying too, just letting Emma scream while she has her breakdowns. Mrs. Walsh, Judge Morrison's voice carried a warning. You've already admitted to conducting illegal surveillance. I suggest you remain silent unless directly questioned. But Margaret was beyond heeding warnings. She leaves Emma alone. I've seen her put the baby in the crib and walk away while she's crying. Dr. Martinez's expression grew stern. The cry-it-out method is a legitimate sleep training technique recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Allowing an infant to self-soothe for short periods is not neglect, it's good parenting. Good parenting? Margaret's voice rose to that shrill pitch again. She feeds that baby formula from bottles she doesn't sterilize properly. I've seen her use bottles that sat out for hours. David was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, once again Mrs. Walsh is describing observations that could only have been made through illegal surveillance. She's lying about everything. Margaret shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. The postpartum depression, the exhaustion, the loving mother act, it's all performance. Michael told me she used to lock herself in the bathroom and scream when Emma was crying. The courtroom fell silent. Even I held my breath, because that part was true. During those first horrible weeks after Michael left, when Emma's colic was at its worst and I was barely sleeping, there had been times when I'd put her safely in her crib and stepped into the bathroom to have a 2-minute breakdown before returning to comfort her. Judge Morrison looked at me expectantly. Mrs. Walsh, is that accurate? My throat felt like sandpaper. Yes, Your Honor. A few times, when Emma was crying and nothing I did helped, I would put her in her crib, where she was safe, and take a very brief break to collect myself. My pediatrician said it was better than getting overwhelmed while holding her. How brief, he asked. Never more than 5 minutes. Usually less. I could feel tears threatening, but I forced them back. I was afraid I might. I never wanted to reach a point where I might accidentally hurt her because I was frustrated. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's exactly what we recommend. Self-awareness and prevention of caregiver overwhelm is crucial for infant safety. But Margaret wasn't done. 5 minutes, she laughed bitterly. Try 20 minutes. I timed it. Emma would be screaming in her crib while Sarah hid in the bathroom having her tantrums. You timed my bathroom breaks? The words came out of me like a gasp. The violation felt so complete, so intimate. She'd been monitoring how long I spent crying in my own bathroom. I documented everything, Margaret said with renewed confidence. Every neglectful moment, every time she chose her own comfort over Emma's needs. David pulled out his phone. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence. Phone records show that on September 8th, a date Mrs. Walsh claims to have witnessed extended crying episodes, my client called the pediatric helpline at 11:47 p.m. and spoke with a nurse for 12 minutes about colic management techniques. He scrolled through his notes. September 15th, she called her pediatrician's emergency line at 2:33 a.m. because Emma's crying had changed pitch and she was concerned about illness. September 22nd, she called her mother in Oregon at 1:15 a.m. asking for advice about sleep training. Each date David read corresponded with one of Margaret's photographs or claims. While Margaret had been lurking outside taking pictures of my supposed failures, I had been desperately seeking help and advice from medical professionals and family. These don't sound like the actions of a neglectful mother, Judge Morrison observed. They sound like someone actively seeking solutions to challenging infant behavior. Margaret's face was flushed now, sweat beading on her upper lip despite the cool courtroom. She manipulated all of them. Just like she manipulated Michael. She makes everyone think she's this perfect victim while my granddaughter suffers. Suffers how, specifically? Dr. Martinez interjected. Because when I examined Emma 3 days ago, she was meeting all developmental milestones, had healthy weight gain, clear eyes, good muscle tone, and obvious secure attachment to her mother. Those aren't signs of suffering, they're signs of excellent care. Patricia Holmes stood shakily. Your Honor, perhaps Mrs. Walsh is overwrought. The stress of these proceedings. The stress of watching her son's life get destroyed. Margaret snapped at her own lawyer. Michael was happy before her. He was successful, confident, planning to propose to Jennifer Chin. The courtroom went dead silent. Jennifer Chin. David's eyebrows shot up, and I saw him glance at his wedding ring. Judge Morrison's pen stopped moving entirely. Jennifer Chin? David asked slowly. Would that be Jennifer Chin, the family law attorney? Margaret nodded vigorously. A lovely girl, so much more suitable than, she stopped, seeming to realize she'd said something wrong, but not quite sure what. Your Honor, David said, his voice carefully controlled, Jennifer Chin is my wife. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Margaret's face went from flushed to ashen in seconds as she realized what she'd just admitted. Patricia Holmes actually groaned audibly and dropped her head into her hands. Your Honor, David continued, his voice steady despite the bombshell that had just exploded, I need to disclose that my wife Jennifer Chin was indeed in a relationship with Michael Walsh from January 2019 to March 2020. Their relationship ended when he began pursuing my client. My world tilted sideways. Michael had cheated on someone to be with me? The timeline crashed through my mind. We'd started dating in February 2020, just weeks after he'd supposedly ended things with Jennifer. No wonder Margaret had hated me from the moment we met. In her mind, I hadn't just stolen her precious son, I'd stolen him from someone she'd already chosen as the perfect daughter-in-law. Furthermore, David said, pulling out his phone, I have text messages from my wife dated March 15, 2020, warning me about the Walsh families, concerning dynamics. Jennifer described Mrs. Walsh as obsessively controlling and said she was grateful to escape that situation. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from stern to deeply troubled. Mr. Chen, this presents a significant conflict of interest. Did your wife's experience with the defendant's family influence your decision to take this case? Not initially, Your Honor. But when Mrs. Walsh began her harassment campaign, my wife recognized the same patterns she'd experienced. The constant phone calls, the unannounced visits, the attempts to control every aspect of Michael's relationships. Margaret shot to her feet despite Officer Reynolds' restraining hand. Jennifer loved our family. She came to Sunday dinners, helped me plan Michael's birthday parties. Because you gave her no choice, David interrupted, reading from his phone. I quote from a text my wife sent me in March 2020. Margaret Walsh called my office 6 times today demanding to know why I missed Michael's cousin's baby shower. I've never felt so suffocated in my life. The parallels to my own experience were horrifying. Margaret had done this before. She'd driven away Michael's previous girlfriend with the same tactics she was using on me: surveillance, harassment, emotional manipulation. Your Honor, Patricia Holmes said weakly, rising on unsteady legs, I move to dismiss these proceedings. It's clear that Mr. Chen cannot provide unbiased representation given his wife's history with my client. But Judge Morrison was shaking his head. Counselor, your client has admitted to purchasing property specifically to conduct surveillance, installing hidden cameras in an infant's nursery, trespassing, making false emergency calls, and harassment. Mr. Chen's personal connections don't change those facts. Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at me with naked hatred, her carefully constructed facade completely abandoned. You destroyed everything, she whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the silent courtroom. Michael was supposed to marry Jennifer. They were going to give me beautiful grandchildren who would have been raised properly. Mrs. Walsh, Officer Reynolds warned, tightening his grip on her arm as she swayed forward. Instead, he threw away his future for some nurse who trapped him with a pregnancy. Margaret's voice rose to that shrill pitch again. Do you know what you cost him? Jennifer's father was going to bring Michael into his law firm as a partner. He had everything planned out. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Margaret hadn't just wanted Michael to marry Jennifer Chen, she'd wanted the prestige, the social connections, the financial security that came with marrying into an established legal family. I was not only the wrong woman, I was the wrong class, the wrong profession, the wrong everything. He gave a partnership in Chen and Associates for you, Margaret continued, her words like poison. And what did you give him in return? Debt, depression, and a screaming baby that ruined his sleep. Mrs. Walsh, that's enough, Judge Morrison commanded, but Margaret was beyond stopping. I tried to help you be better. I tried to teach you how to be a proper mother, a proper wife, but you were too stubborn and selfish to listen. Spittle flew from her lips as she spoke. So I documented everything. Every failure, every breakdown, every moment that proved you didn't deserve my son or my granddaughter. David stood slowly. Your Honor, I think we're seeing exactly why my client has been afraid to allow unsupervised visitation. Margaret whirled on him. Your wife understood family loyalty. She respected traditions, knew how to dress appropriately, spoke properly. Your Honor, I found my voice, surprising myself with its steadiness. She's describing why Jennifer left Michael. Because she couldn't stand the pressure and control. Shut up. Margaret screamed. You don't get to speak. You destroyed my family. The courtroom erupted as Margaret lunged toward me again, this time breaking free from Officer Reynolds' grip long enough to take 2 steps before he tackled her back. Judge Morrison's gavel came down repeatedly as Margaret screamed obscenities that made the court reporter's eyes widen. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, watching the woman who wanted to raise my daughter reveal exactly who she really was beneath all that silver hair and pressed navy fabric. The bailiff called for backup as Margaret continued thrashing against Officer Reynolds, her perfectly manicured nails leaving scratches on his uniform. But what chilled me to the bone wasn't her physical violence, it was the look in her eyes when they locked onto mine. Pure, calculating hatred that promised this was far from over. Your Honor, David said once Margaret was finally restrained by 2 officers, I have one more piece of evidence that I believe is crucial to these proceedings. Judge Morrison looked exhausted, his gray hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Proceed, but make it quick. This hearing has already gone far beyond. Emma Walsh's medical records show she was hospitalized for dehydration on July 23rd, David interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mrs. Walsh, you were babysitting that day, weren't you? Margaret stopped struggling immediately. The sudden silence was more unsettling than her screaming had been. Patricia Holmes, who'd been frantically packing her briefcase like she couldn't escape fast enough, froze with papers halfway to her bag. That was an accident, Margaret whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the pin-drop silence. My heart stopped. Emma's hospitalization, I'd been at work, pulling a double shift to cover for a colleague. Margaret had insisted on watching Emma, claiming she needed more time with her granddaughter. When I got the call from Mercy General's emergency room, they said Emma had been brought in severely dehydrated by her grandmother. An accident? Dr. Martinez spoke up from the witness stand, her voice sharp. A 3-month-old doesn't become that dehydrated accidentally. Someone had to withhold fluids for at least 8 hours. She wouldn't take a bottle. Margaret protested, but something in her tone made my skin crawl. I tried everything, but she kept refusing. What kind of bottle? David asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a blade. I watched Margaret's face cycle through emotions, confusion, realization, then something that looked almost like guilt. Regular formula, she stammered. But Emma was exclusively breastfed at 3 months old, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You knew that. You knew she'd never taken a bottle because I was nursing her. Dr. Martinez was pulling up records on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. The medical report from July 23rd shows the infant had lost nearly 8% of her birth weight. That's consistent with prolonged fluid deprivation. You gave her formula knowing she wouldn't take it, I continued, pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. You let her get dehydrated on purpose so I'd look like a bad mother for leaving her with a sitter. Margaret's silence was deafening. Patricia Holmes had stopped pretending to pack and was staring at her client with undisguised horror. Mrs. Walsh, Judge Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. Did you deliberately withhold appropriate nutrition from a 3-month-old infant? I was trying to wean her off the breast. Margaret finally exploded. Sarah was using nursing as an excuse to keep Emma dependent on her. A bottle would have been better. A 3-month-old exclusively breastfed baby can't be suddenly switched to formula, Dr. Martinez interrupted. Any caregiver should know that. Did Sarah provide you with pumped breast milk for that day? The memory hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent the entire night before my shift pumping milk, leaving Margaret with 4 bottles clearly labeled with times and amounts. I'd written detailed instructions about warming the milk, about Emma's feeding schedule, about everything. Where was the breast milk I pumped, Margaret? I asked, though I already knew the answer from her expression. Breast milk spoils, she muttered. It didn't smell right, so I threw it out for safety. David was already reaching for his briefcase. Your Honor, I had the feeding instructions Sarah provided, written in her handwriting and dated July 23rd. She left 4 bottles of pumped milk with detailed warming instructions. Margaret's last defense crumbled. Fine. I threw it out. That baby needed to learn to take a bottle like normal children do. Sarah was making her too dependent. You hospitalized my daughter, I whispered, the full weight of it hitting me. You let Emma dehydrate for hours because you wanted to prove some point about bottle feeding. Judge Morrison's face had gone from stern to thunderous. Mrs. Walsh, you deliberately endangered an infant's health to, what? Make a point about feeding preferences? I was protecting Emma from Sarah's selfish choices. Margaret screamed. Breastfeeding that long is unnatural. It's about control, not nutrition. The courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys and Margaret's ragged breathing. Even the officers restraining her seemed stunned by what they'd just heard. Dr. Martinez broke the silence, her voice clinical but laced with anger. Your Honor, what Mrs. Walsh describes as child endangerment. She knowingly withheld appropriate nutrition from an infant, resulting in hospitalization. This goes beyond custody disputes into criminal territory. Margaret's face went white as the implications sank in. She looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for allies who simply weren't there. I want my granddaughter, she whispered, but the words sounded hollow now, pathetic. Emma belongs with family who can provide stability. Mrs. Walsh, Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, you've just confessed to child endangerment. I'm ordering an immediate psychiatric evaluation and referring this case to the district attorney for criminal charges. Judge Morrison's words about psychiatric evaluation and criminal charges should have felt like victory, but Margaret's laugh, low and bitter, made my blood freeze. She'd stopped struggling against the officers, her silver hair now completely disheveled, but her eyes held a clarity that was somehow more terrifying than her earlier hysteria. You think this ends it? She said, her voice carrying an eerie calm. Sarah, sweet naive Sarah, you have no idea what's coming. Patricia Holmes was frantically gathering her papers. Your Honor, my client is clearly under extreme duress. Any statements she makes now are being recorded and will be used in criminal proceedings, Judge Morrison finished coldly. Mrs. Walsh, I strongly advise you to remain silent. But Margaret ignored him, her gaze locked on mine with laser focus. Emma's trust fund from her grandfather, Michael's father, has been in my name as trustee since she was born. Did you know that, Sarah? $47,000 that I control until she turns 18. My stomach dropped. Michael's father had died when Emma was 2 months old, and Michael had mentioned something about inheritance, but I'd been so overwhelmed with new motherhood that I hadn't paid attention to the details. Furthermore, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, the life insurance policy Michael took out lists me as Emma's guardian if anything happens to both parents. I made sure of that when you two got married. David was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. Your Honor, we were never made aware of any trust fund or insurance policies. Because they don't affect custody, Margaret said with renewed satisfaction. But they will affect Emma's future. Every penny of her inheritance, every decision about her education, her medical care if Sarah can't afford it, all of that goes through me until Emma is an adult. Judge Morrison's expression darkened. Mrs. Walsh, are you threatening to use financial leverage too? I'm stating facts, Margaret interrupted. Sarah makes $34,000 a year as a nurse. She lives in a rented duplex with a mortgage payment of $1,400 a month. Her student loans total $48,000. She can't even afford decent daycare. The specificity of her knowledge made my skin crawl. How did she know my exact salary, my mortgage payment, my student loan balance? I watched David's face go pale as he realized the implications. Your Honor, David said quickly, if Mrs. Walsh has been conducting financial surveillance in addition to physical surveillance. I've been protecting Emma's interests, Margaret cut him off. Sarah's bank account shows she's been late on her electric bill 3 times since Michael left. She's been buying generic formula to supplement nursing because she's not producing enough milk. Her car failed inspection last month, and she can't afford the $800 in repairs. Each fact hit me like a physical blow, not because they were lies, but because they were true. The struggles of single motherhood that I tried so hard to hide from everyone, the late bills, the generic formula when my milk supply dropped due to stress, the car that barely ran but couldn't be fixed on my stretched budget. How do you know all of this? I whispered. Margaret's smile returned, cold and triumphant. I know everything, Sarah. Your credit score, it's dropped 80 points since Michael left. Your grocery spending, down to $64 a week. The 3 applications for second jobs that were rejected because you can't work nights without childcare. Patricia Holmes was tugging desperately on Margaret's arm. Mrs. Walsh, please stop talking. Why should I stop? Margaret shrugged off her lawyer's grip. The judge wants facts about Emma's welfare? Here are facts. Sarah borrowed $400 from her sister last month to pay her pediatrician bill. She's been watering down Emma's formula to make it last longer. She applied for WIC benefits and was denied because she makes $12 over the income limit. The courtroom spun around me. Every private struggle, every desperate measure I'd taken to keep Emma fed and healthy while maintaining some shred of dignity, Margaret had been documenting it all like a predator studying prey. Judge Morrison's voice cut through my panic. Mrs. Walsh, how exactly did you obtain this financial information? Margaret's pause lasted one heartbeat too long. Public records. Credit reports. Anyone can. No, David interrupted sharply. Credit reports require consent or court orders. Bank account information is protected. Your Honor, Mrs. Walsh has just confessed to financial identity theft and fraud. The color drained from Margaret's face as she realized her mistake. Patricia Holmes actually groaned aloud and dropped into her chair. But Margaret wasn't done. In a last desperate gambit, she pulled something from her purse, a thick manila envelope I hadn't noticed before. I have signed statements, she announced, holding the envelope high. 3 neighbors, 2 of Emma's doctors, and a social worker who's been monitoring Sarah's situation. All of them have concerns about Emma's welfare. My world collapsed. A social worker? What social worker? And which doctors? Dr. Martinez was sitting right here supporting me. Who else had Margaret gotten to? David was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, no statements from social workers or medical professionals were disclosed in discovery. Because I just received them this morning, Margaret said triumphantly. Fresh evidence of Sarah's deteriorating ability to care for Emma properly. Judge Morrison extended his hand. I'll review those statements now. As Margaret's smile widened, I realized that despite everything, the illegal surveillance, the stalking, the child endangerment, she still had one more card to play. And this one might actually work. As Judge Morrison opened the manila envelope, Margaret's triumphant expression faltered when David pulled out his own folder from his briefcase. Your Honor, before you review those alleged statements, I need to inform the court that I filed a motion this morning for a preliminary injunction against Mrs. Walsh based on evidence we discovered yesterday evening. Margaret's face went ashen. What evidence? David opened his folder with deliberate precision. Mrs. Walsh, do you know Dr. Amanda Foster from Riverside Pediatrics? She's one of Emma's doctors, Margaret stammered, but I could see confusion in her eyes. Emma had never been to Riverside Pediatrics. Our insurance didn't even cover that practice. Actually, Dr. Foster has never treated Emma Walsh, David continued smoothly. But someone claiming to be Sarah Walsh called Dr. Foster's office 6 times requesting Emma's medical records be transferred there. When Dr. Foster's staff asked for verification, the caller provided Sarah's social security number and birth date. My stomach clenched. I never called any Dr. Foster. I don't even know who that is. David nodded grimly. The calls were traced to a cell phone registered to Margaret Walsh on September 3rd. Mrs. Walsh, you impersonated my client to obtain access to Emma's medical records at an unauthorized practice. Margaret's lawyer Patricia Holmes looked like she was about to be sick. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of any of this. Furthermore, David continued, the so-called social worker mentioned in Mrs. Walsh's statements? Her name is Linda Morrison, note the same surname as Your Honor, which I'm sure is purely coincidental. Ms. Morrison works for Child Protective Services in Millbrook County, where Mrs. Walsh resides, not here in Davidson County where Emma lives. Judge Morrison's expression darkened as he examined the papers from Margaret's envelope. These statements are dated yesterday, October 17th, but they reference incidents from this week. How did witnesses in Millbrook County observe events occurring 12 miles away in Davidson County? Margaret opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. The carefully orchestrated evidence she'd been so confident about was unraveling before our eyes. Mrs. Walsh, David said, his voice cutting through the silence, did you pay Linda Morrison to file a false CPS report? No. I would never, Margaret's voice cracked. She's a family friend. She was concerned when I told her about Emma's situation. A family friend who happens to work for CPS and filed a report based entirely on secondhand information from someone she knew was conducting illegal surveillance? Judge Morrison's voice carried dangerous undertones. David wasn't finished. Your Honor, I also have phone records showing that Mrs. Walsh called Dr. Foster's office claiming to be Emma's grandmother, requesting they provide a written statement about Sarah's concerning behavior during a visit that never happened. Margaret suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from Judge Morrison's desk. Those records are wrong. I was trying to protect Emma from neglect. Officer Reynolds caught her arm before she could reach the documents, but not before several papers scattered across the floor. As the court clerk helped gather them, I caught a glimpse of one sheet that made my blood freeze. It was a petition for emergency custody, pre-signed and dated for today, listing Margaret Walsh as the requesting party. She'd come to court not just hoping to discredit me, but with legal papers already prepared to take Emma home immediately. Judge Morrison saw it too. His face went from stern to thunderous as he held up the custody petition. Mrs. Walsh, you came to my courtroom with forged statements, fraudulent medical claims, and pre-signed emergency custody papers? His voice was barely controlled fury. Were you planning to manipulate these proceedings to obtain immediate custody regardless of the evidence presented? Margaret's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Emma belongs with me, she whispered, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. I won't let that woman destroy another generation of my family. The words another generation hung in the air like a curse. Judge Morrison's pen stopped moving entirely, and even Patricia Holmes looked up from her frantic note-taking. Another generation? David repeated slowly. Mrs. Walsh, what exactly do you mean by that? Margaret's eyes went wide as she realized what she'd said. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head frantically, but Judge Morrison was already leaning forward. Mrs. Walsh, I'm ordering you to answer Mr. Chen's question. What did you mean about another generation? The silence stretched until I thought the courtroom might crack from the tension. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with strain. I misspoke, she finally whispered. I was upset, I didn't mean. Your Honor, David interrupted, pulling out another document. I think Mrs. Walsh was referring to Michael's older brother, David Walsh, who died in 2003. Margaret's gasp was audible throughout the courtroom. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking suddenly frail and ancient. How do you know about David? She breathed. Because his death certificate lists cause of death as accidental drowning, but the police report tells a different story, David continued grimly. 22-year-old David Walsh drowned in the family pool during a barbecue at the Walsh residence on June 15, 2003. He'd been arguing with his mother about his engagement to Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Martinez's sister. Dr. Martinez straightened in the witness chair, her face going pale. David Walsh? That was, oh my God. Rebecca never talked about how he died, just that it was sudden. The police report shows that David had been drinking, but his blood alcohol level was only 0.06, below the legal limit. However, toxicology also showed traces of diazepam, a sedative that none of the other party guests tested positive for. Margaret shot to her feet, nearly falling as Officer Reynolds steadied her. That's enough. David's death has nothing to do with Emma. Doesn't it? David pulled out a photograph that made my stomach lurch. It showed a young man who looked exactly like Michael, standing next to a smiling woman with dark hair. This is David Walsh and Rebecca Martinez at their engagement party, May 2003. According to Rebecca's statement to police, your son had given you an ultimatum, accept his fiancée or lose him forever. Judge Morrison was making rapid notes, his expression growing darker by the moment. Mrs. Walsh, were you questioned in connection with your son's death? He drowned, Margaret said flatly. It was an accident. The investigation was closed. After Rebecca Martinez withdrew her statement and moved to California, David added, Your Honor, I spoke with Rebecca Martinez yesterday. She agreed to provide testimony about the Walsh family dynamics if needed. Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. Rebecca Martinez was a gold digger, just like Sarah. She wanted David's inheritance money, wanted to take him away from his family. She wanted to marry him, I found myself saying, my voice cutting through Margaret's rambling. Just like Michael wanted to marry me. But you couldn't stand losing control. Control? Margaret whirled on me, her eyes blazing. I raised two beautiful boys to be successful, accomplished men. David was going to be a doctor before that woman filled his head with nonsense about independence and setting boundaries. So you drugged him, David said quietly. You put diazepam in his drink at the barbecue, thinking you'd make him sick enough to miss his engagement party the next day. But he went swimming while impaired. No. Margaret screamed. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. He was supposed to just get sick, supposed to realize Rebecca was more important to him than family. She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she'd just confessed. The courtroom fell dead silent except for the frantic scratching of the court reporter's keys. Judge Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. Mrs. Walsh, did you just admit to drugging your son David before his death? Margaret's breathing was rapid and shallow, like a trapped animal. Patricia Holmes was frantically whispering, don't say another word, but Margaret seemed beyond hearing. Michael was supposed to be different, she whispered, staring directly at me with hollow eyes. After David died, Michael was all I had left. He was supposed to marry Jennifer Chen, have proper children with a proper family. My blood turned to ice as the full scope of her obsession became clear. Margaret hadn't just wanted to control her son's relationships, she'd been willing to kill to maintain that control. And now she wanted my daughter. Instead, he chose you, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. Another manipulative girl trying to steal my family's legacy. But I won't make the same mistake twice. Officer Reynolds was already reaching for his handcuffs as Judge Morrison's gavel came down with thunderous finality. The handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the silent courtroom. But even as Officer Reynolds read her Miranda rights, her eyes never left mine, burning with a hatred so pure it made my skin crawl. This isn't over, Sarah, she said, her voice eerily calm despite the metal restraints. Emma will know the truth about what you are. What you've always been. Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard. Mrs. Walsh, you're being held in contempt pending criminal charges for child endangerment, stalking, harassment, fraud, and conspiracy in connection with the death of David Walsh. You are to have no contact whatsoever with Sarah Walsh or Emma Walsh. As the officers began leading Margaret away, she twisted back one final time. Check Emma's diaper bag, Sarah. The pink one with the elephants that I gave her last month. You might find it illuminating. My blood froze. Emma's diaper bag was at my sister's house with Emma right now. The bag Margaret had insisted on buying because every grandmother should provide something special for her granddaughter. What had she hidden inside it? David was already on his phone. I'm calling your sister right now. Don't touch that bag when you get there. If Margaret planted something, we need police to document it properly. Judge Morrison waited until Margaret was completely removed from the courtroom before continuing. Mr. Chen, given the severity of what we've uncovered today, I'm granting your client full custody with no visitation rights for Mrs. Walsh. Furthermore, I'm issuing an emergency restraining order with a 500-yard minimum distance. Patricia Holmes, who looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour, finally stood. Your Honor, I'm formally withdrawing as counsel for Margaret Walsh, effective immediately. I had no knowledge of any criminal activity, and I'll be cooperating fully with the district attorney's investigation. Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I nearly collapsed in my chair. Emma was mine. Officially, legally mine. Margaret couldn't take her, couldn't even come near her. But David's expression remained grim as he ended his call with my sister. Sarah, we need to get to your sister's house immediately. The police are meeting us there. What did she say? Is Emma okay? Emma's fine, but your sister found something in the diaper bag while we were in court. She didn't want to say what over the phone, but she sounded shaken. Judge Morrison overheard and called out as we gathered our papers. Mr. Chen, I want to be notified immediately of whatever you find. If Mrs. Walsh has committed additional crimes involving that child. Of course, Your Honor. We'll have a full report within the hour. As we rushed toward the courthouse exit, I caught sight of Margaret through a window, being loaded into a police car. Even handcuffed and defeated, she managed to look directly at me through the glass. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could read them clearly. This isn't over. 20 minutes later, we stood in my sister Jenny's living room, staring at Emma's pink elephant diaper bag like it contained a bomb. Detective Rivera from the Davidson County Police Department was photographing it from every angle while Emma played happily in her playpen, oblivious to the drama swirling around her. Mrs. Walsh, Detective Rivera said, pulling on latex gloves, your sister found this sewn into the lining. She held up a small digital recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive. It appears to have been recording continuously for approximately 6 weeks. My knees gave out. 6 weeks of private moments, feeding Emma, changing her, talking to her, singing lullabies, all recorded by the woman who'd just confessed to drugging her own son. Margaret hadn't just been watching from next door, she'd been listening to every intimate moment of motherhood I thought was private. There's more, Detective Rivera continued grimly. We found a GPS tracking device in the bag's exterior pocket and what appears to be a small vial of liquid sewn into the padding. Detective Rivera held up the small vial with tweezers, the clear liquid inside catching the afternoon light streaming through Jenny's window. We'll need to test this, but given Mrs. Walsh's confession about David Walsh, I suspect we know what we'll find. The same diazepam that had killed Michael's brother 20 years ago. Margaret had been carrying it around in Emma's diaper bag for 6 weeks, waiting for the right moment. My hands shook as the full scope of her plan became clear. She hadn't just wanted custody of Emma. She'd been planning to eliminate me entirely. The recording device captured something interesting from last Tuesday, Detective Rivera continued, connecting the device to a small speaker. Mrs. Walsh apparently forgot it was recording when she made a phone call. Margaret's voice filled Jenny's living room, crystal clear and chillingly calm. Linda, I need you to backdate that CPS report to October 10th. Make it look like you've been monitoring the situation for weeks. Yes, I know it's fraud, but Sarah won't be around long enough for anyone to investigate thoroughly. Emma looked up from her toys at the sound of her grandmother's voice, clapping her hands happily. She had no idea she'd been carrying evidence of a murder plot in her diaper bag for over a month. David was already on his phone with the district attorney's office. They're adding attempted murder and conspiracy charges, he said, ending the call. Margaret Walsh won't see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of her life. Detective Rivera carefully sealed the vial in an evidence bag. Mrs. Walsh, you and Emma will need police protection until we're certain Mrs. Walsh was acting alone. We're also investigating whether Michael Walsh had any knowledge of his mother's activities. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Michael. I just heard what happened. I'm so sorry. I never knew how sick she was. Please let me see Emma when you're ready. I want to make this right. I showed the text to David, who frowned. Don't respond yet. We need to verify he wasn't involved in his mother's schemes. But something in Michael's message felt genuine, the exhaustion, the horror, the recognition that his mother had destroyed everything he'd once loved. Margaret had spent so much energy trying to control her son's lives that she'd driven both of them away forever. Detective Rivera packed up the last of the evidence. The good news is that Mrs. Walsh's surveillance actually worked against her. 6 weeks of recordings prove you're an excellent mother, Mrs. Walsh. She documented her own defeat. As the police left and David finished his paperwork, I finally allowed myself to hold Emma properly for the first time all day. She snuggled against my shoulder, completely trusting, completely safe. Mama, she babbled, one of her first clear words. Jenny wiped tears from her eyes. She knows, Sarah. She knows you fought for her. My phone rang, Judge Morrison's clerk, calling to schedule the final custody hearing for next week. A formality now, but one that would officially end the nightmare Margaret Walsh had created. Mrs. Walsh, the clerk said. Judge Morrison wanted me to tell you something. In 30 years on the bench, he's never seen a mother fight harder for her child. Emma is lucky to have you. As I hung up, I realized Margaret had been right about one thing. This had been about family legacy. But not the way she'd imagined. The legacy I was giving Emma wasn't money or social connections or carefully orchestrated perfection. It was the knowledge that her mother would move mountains to keep her safe. That love doesn't control, it protects. And that sometimes the greatest victory is simply being allowed to remain exactly who you are, a mother who would never, ever give up. Margaret Walsh had walked into court smiling with evidence, but one simple question about how she'd obtained it had revealed the truth that destroyed her forever. Emma was home where she belonged, and I was finally free to be the mother I'd always been, imperfect, exhausted, but completely devoted. The nightmare was over.